On June 19, 1971, the U.S. President Richard Nixon, during a press briefing, declared,
America's public enemy number one in the United States is drug abuse.
launching what we all know today as the war on drugs. 41 years later, we can see the effect that the war on drugs has had on the United States and the world. The war on drugs tried to take a stand against drug use, but instead it led to mass incarceration, increased drug trafficking, and a more militarized police force, and was used to hurt underrepresented communities. Richard Nixon, first elected to House of Representatives and Senate, later ran for president, becoming the 37th president of the United States, serving from 1969 to 1974. Nixon began the war on drugs, announcing that
Will be nationwide in terms of a new educational program that we trust will result from the discussions that we have had.
Nixon, in the beginning, stated that this program was going to focus on educating people on drugs and putting more funding towards rehabilitation in order to end drug abuse by researching the problem and finding the best way to help drug addicts. In 1973, things took a sharp turn. Nixon created the Drug Enforcement Agency, and soon after, many drugs such as marijuana, ecstasy, amphetamines, cocaine, and bath salts all became illegal. Soon after, Congress passed the Boggs Act. This act established the policy of mandatory minimum sentencing. Mandatory minimums require courts to sentence first-time offenders with minimum sentences depending on the drugs they were caught with. This was made in an attempt to prevent people from ever trying drugs since the penalty would be so large. But instead, it prevented people who had drug problems from getting help since they would get arrested instead of getting the help that they drastically needed. It got so bad that according to the Federal Bureau of Prisons, 49.8% of inmates, about 100,000 people, are currently incarcerated due to drug offenses, and less than 30% of those inmates are violent offenders. A problem that came out of this was discrimination based on race. It was later realized that mandatory minimum sentencing was very racialized. For example, crack cocaine sentences are 100 times harsher than the powder form of crack cocaine. Despite the fact that they are the exact same drug, crack cocaine is used predominantly by the black communities, and the powder form is consumed predominantly by the white communities. This resulted in 6 times more African Americans in jail than their white counterparts. One of Nixon's aides later admitted to this in a statement, saying, "We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or blacks, but by getting the public to associate hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt their communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did." End quote. This and many other examples are what led people to believe that the war on drugs was purposely created to hurt communities of color.
But when you have mandatory minimum sentencing, the judge, their hands are tied. Despite the conditions of this person. And that judge may be thinking, I could salvage this person. They've never had a chance before. But the policies say, no, 20 years.
A more militarized police force. Not only has the war on drugs hurt minority communities, but it has also militarized the police. Now, it allows them to use more force on people where it is not always needed. In 1996, Congress gave the Department of Defense the ability to more easily provide military-grade protection and weapons. Today, we see programs like 1033, which provide a large number of small towns with large weapons like tanks, grenade launchers, and high-caliber assault rifles. The combination of the expanded police authority and expanded access to military-grade weapons have led to more and more cases every year of police hurting civilians in situations where it was not needed. In Georgia, a baby was badly burned when the police threw a flashbang grenade into his crib during a drug raid, and the grandfather was killed by police raid on his house in October. There were no arrests that day, nor did they find anything in the house during the raid where the baby was burned. Later on, it was found that the evidence used to invade the grandfather's house was not completely accurate. These are just 2 examples where the war on drugs unnecessarily hurt people due to law enforcement militarization. Drug trafficking. The war on drugs did not always involve drug use in the US, but it also involved drug trade across the US-Mexican border, where drug cartels have become more and more powerful ever since the passing of the war on drugs. Since they are more efficient in moving drugs, they were able to bring drugs without being noticed, so much so that the DEA only catches 1% of the drugs which circulate around the US. The drug cartels have been able to hide drugs in places that the police would never be able to find, like hidden inside of cars and inside of trucks. CNN journalist Don Winslow said in an article, 15 years on the border observing the war on drugs, cocaine, heroin, meth poured across, mostly carried in trucks, also hidden in cars, lunged by foot on human mules, walked across, taped on people's bodies, hidden inside corpses, packed across actual mules and horses, two of which abandoned in the desert to live out their lives, ran through tunnels, and launched by catapults. How could they have better dealt with the drug problem? We have focused a lot on how the US has failed at fixing the drug problem, and the even larger amount of problems that came out of the war on drugs. But how should they have dealt with this, and are there any examples of countries that have found a proper way to deal with their drug problem? In the late 60s, Switzerland was facing a very large heroin epidemic. HIV and AIDS rates were increasing at an alarming amount. And street crime became a large problem. So the government opened up free heroin maintenance centers where heroin addicts could go and seek help. They were given access to high-quality heroin, clean needles, injection rooms, and medical supervision, while social workers helped them to find housing and work. This led to a drop in crime. The AIDS rates began to decrease, since addicts didn't need to worry about financing their addiction, but instead finding work and improving their lives. This led them to no longer needing heroin, since the majority of addicts got hooked on heroin because their lives had gotten to such a low point that they take drugs to help them escape reality. HIV infections have dropped drastically, and the deaths from heroin overdoses have dropped by 50%. Conclusion. Richard Nixon, the 37th President of the United States, is remembered as one of the most disgraced US presidents in history, creating one of the most devastating drug policies in US history. Originally, this was created to lessen the drug problem through proper education and rehabilitation. Yet, as time went on, it began to seem like the war on drugs was used to hurt communities that did not like Nixon or his administration. Despite the intent of the war on drugs, the impact that the war caused is indisputable and has impacted a wide range of people. This drug policy has led to increased incarceration, increased drug trade, and a failure to cure the drug problem.